You don't belong near this war machine. Step away now. But when her grease-stained jumpsuit caught on the turret ring and ripped, the tattoo on her spine froze the entire motor pool. It was a symbol no one alive was supposed to wear. The air at forward operating base Vigilance tasted of iron. A fine, gritty dust, churned up by the ceaseless Afghan winds, coated everything in a layer of ochre. It settled on the razor wire, on the sandbagged parapets, and on the hulking silhouettes of the M1 Abrams tanks parked in the motor pool. They sat like sleeping iron beasts, their cannons pointed toward a horizon that promised nothing but heat and hostility. The smell was a potent cocktail of diesel fuel, hot metal, and the faint, acrid tang of cordite that clung to the air long after training exercises were over. This was a place of high tension and low tolerance, where routine was a shield against chaos, and anything out of the ordinary was viewed with suspicion. Rowan Hale was out of the ordinary. At 40, she moved with a quiet economy that was unnerving in a place built on shouted orders and performative urgency. She was a civilian contractor, a ghost in a tan jumpsuit who haunted the fringes of the base's ecosystem. Her dark blonde hair was always pulled back in a tight, functional braid, and her face, etched with fine lines around the eyes from years under unforgiving suns, was a neutral mask. She didn't socialize, she didn't fraternize, and she didn't waste a single motion. When she worked, her hands were a blur of precise, confident movements, diagnosing problems with an instinct that made the base's formally trained mechanics uneasy. That unease curdled into open contempt among a certain trio. Corporal Diaz, a man who wore his cynicism like a second layer of body armor, watched her from the shade of a Humvee. He chewed on a toothpick, his eyes narrowed. "Look at her," he muttered to Private First Class Granger, a bull-necked soldier who communicated primarily through grunts and shows of physical dominance. "Acts like she owns the place. Civilian hires. They're all the same. Here to cash a check and get in the way." Granger spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dust. "Doesn't even talk. It's creepy. She thinks she's better than us," Diaz said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Just because she can fix a comms rig the rest of us tagged for scrap doesn't mean she knows jack about real pressure." He was referring to the incident last week, when a communications vehicle's power supply had been declared dead. Rowan had been called in, and within 20 minutes, had it humming back to life with a simple bypass the others had overlooked. It hadn't earned her respect, it had earned her resentment. Private Luke, the youngest of the three, shifted uncomfortably. He was impressionable, caught in the gravitational pull of the older soldiers' attitudes. "She seems to know what she's doing, though." "Luck," Diaz scoffed. "Or she just Googled it. This isn't some garage back home, kid. This is the army. There's a way things are done." The way things were done soon involved a series of petty, deniable acts of sabotage. A specialized socket wrench would vanish from her toolkit, only to reappear in a different bay a day later. The small corner of the break room where she drank her black coffee would mysteriously become cluttered with discarded equipment boxes. Her requests for replacement parts were perpetually lost in the system. Rowan never reacted. She simply adapted, sourcing her own tools from a personal locker and finding alternate solutions that didn't require official channels. Her silence was mistaken for weakness, for the timid compliance of an outsider who knew she didn't belong. They didn't understand that her silence was a fortress, built over years of practice. The breaking point arrived on a blistering Thursday. Havoc 1, the lead tank for a critical patrol scheduled for the next morning, wouldn't start. Its gas turbine engine, a complex and temperamental beast, gave only a pathetic whine. The chief mechanic and his team had swarmed it for hours, their frustration mounting with the temperature, until they finally threw up their hands in defeat. The turbine controller was fried, they declared. It would take a week to get a replacement. The operations officer, a tense captain with a rapidly thinning hairline, was out of options. His eyes scanned the motor pool, finally landing on the lone figure of Rowan Hale as she methodically cleaned her tools. He strode over, his expression a mixture of desperation and distaste. "Hale, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. Havoc 1. The engine's dead. Chief says the controller's shot. You're the last resort. Get it running by 0600, or the mission is scrubbed. A murmur went through the assembled mechanics. Diaz smirked, folding his arms. Granger cracked his knuckles. This was it. This was the impossible task, the one that would finally expose her as the fraud they all believed her to be. Rowan simply wiped her hands on a rag, looked past the captain at the silent, monolithic tank, and gave a single, curt nod. I'll take a look. The engine bay of an M1 Abrams is not a workspace, it's a metallic gut. A cramped, suffocating labyrinth of wires, hoses, and steel, it smelled of hot grease, hydraulic fluid, and ozone. The desert sun had baked the tank's armor for hours, turning the compartment into an oven. As Rowan Hale swung herself inside, a wave of heat washed over her, so intense it was like stepping into a fire. She landed with a soft thud on the greasy floor plates, the world outside shrinking to a bright, dusty rectangle. Outside that rectangle, the audience gathered. Diaz, Granger, and Luke positioned themselves conspicuously, their mockery now a public performance. I give her an hour before she's crying for her mommy, Granger said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Nah, I'll bet 20 she doesn't even last that long, Diaz countered, leaning against a fuel drum with a smug grin. Probably break a nail and call it a day. She's way out of her league. This isn't a toaster oven. Luke stayed quiet, his gaze fixed on the dark opening where Rowan had disappeared. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach, but the pressure to conform, to be part of the group, was stronger. He watched, silent. Inside the belly of the beast, Rowan ignored them. Their voices were just part of the ambient noise, like the distant whine of the base's generators or the buzzing of flies. Her world had narrowed to the task at hand. Her fingers, surprisingly nimble for their callous state, traced wiring harnesses, tested connections, and checked fluid lines with a practiced, almost surgical grace. She didn't consult a manual, the schematic was etched into her memory. Her mind was a quiet, focused space where every component had a purpose and every failure point was a question waiting for an answer. She found the problem in less than 30 minutes. It wasn't the main turbine controller as the mechanics had assumed. It was a secondary power regulator, a small, fist-sized box tucked deep behind a coolant manifold. It was a rookie mistake to miss it, but the part was notoriously difficult to reach. Replacing it would require her to contort her body into an awkward, strained position. She took a deep breath, the superheated air searing her lungs, and began the delicate operation. Lying on her side, she reached one arm deep into the tank's innards, a socket wrench in her hand. Her muscles screamed in protest. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes. The fabric of her jumpsuit was soaked through, clinging uncomfortably to her skin. She twisted her torso for better leverage, her back arching against a metal strut. It was then that a sharp, jagged edge on the turret rings housing snagged the worn fabric of her jumpsuit, right between her shoulder blades. She felt a sudden tension, then, as she applied more force to a stubborn bolt, the sound ripped through the quiet hum of the motor pool. Rip. The sound was loud, definitive. The back of her jumpsuit tore clean open, from her neck down to the middle of her back. A sudden, almost shocking rush of cooler air hit her sweat-drenched skin. Outside, the laughter died instantly. It was replaced by a thick, profound silence. Diaz, who had been in the middle of a joke, froze with his mouth half open. Granger's smug expression dissolved into slack-jawed disbelief. Every eye in the motor pool was locked on Rowan's exposed back. As she shifted again to finish her work, the torn flaps of her jumpsuit fell away completely. And there it was. Not a piece of fashionable ink. Not a whimsical design. It was a brand. Weathered by time and sun, the lines were stark, brutal, and unmistakable. Running down the length of her spine was a tattoo of a sword, its blade snapped in two, piercing a grinning skeletal mask. From behind the mask, four jagged lightning bolts erupted like claws. The ink was a deep, faded crimson, the color of old blood, set against the stark black of the mask. It wasn't art. It was a declaration. Luke stumbled back a step, his face draining of all color. His breath hitched in his throat. He'd seen that symbol once, in a heavily redacted documentary about Special Operations Ghost units. A single frame, shown for less than a second. Holy, that can't be, Diaz stammered, the toothpick falling from his lips. Luke's voice was a choked whisper, but in the dead silence, it carried like a shout. That's the Crimson Sigil. That's from Crimson 17. The name hung in the air, thick with rumor and myth. Crimson 17. The ghost team from Al-Hudra. The unit the Pentagon denied had ever existed. The unit that was supposedly wiped out to the last man 13 years ago. A sharp, metallic click broke the spell. Someone near the edge of the crowd, hidden in the shadows, lowered their phone. A photo had been taken. A photo that was already being uploaded to the base's internal chat server. The legend had just walked out of the shadows and into the harsh light of FOB vigilance. Major General Thomas Decker believed in order, paperwork, and a clear chain of command. At 58, his career was a monument to precise strategy and ruthless efficiency. His office was immaculate, his uniform was flawless, and his belief in ghosts was non-existent. Ghosts were a failure of intelligence, a gap in the data. And yet, as his convoy rolled through the main gate of FOB vigilance for a routine inspection, a ghost was exactly what he was about to find. The trip was a necessary chore: shake hands, review logistics, nod through a briefing on fuel consumption. The motor pool wasn't even on his official itinerary. But as his Humvee slowed to navigate a refueling truck, his gaze swept idly across the bay. He saw the cluster of stunned mechanics, the silent Abrams tank, and the figure of a woman emerging from its engine bay. And then he saw her back. He didn't see it clearly, just a glimpse as she stood and stretched, her jumpsuit hanging in tatters. But it was enough. The flash of crimson and black. The unmistakable shape of a broken sword piercing a skull. The world went silent. The radio chatter in his earpiece faded to a dull hum. The face of his aide, turning to ask him a question, became a meaningless blur. General Decker was no longer in the back of a Humvee at FOB vigilance. He was 13 years in the past, in a darkened command tent, staring at a grainy drone feed from the Al-Hudra Valley. He was watching fire and smoke consume what was left of Crimson 17, the most effective, and most deniable, asset he had ever commanded. He remembered the after-action report, stamped with the highest classification. No survivors. Case sealed. He remembered signing off on it, his stomach churning with a grief he could never publicly acknowledge. The insignia was their own design, a secret badge of unity inked onto their bodies in defiance of regulations. It was never meant to be seen by anyone outside the unit. It was the mark of the dead. And it was standing in broad daylight in his motor pool. Stop the vehicle, Decker's voice was a low growl, cutting through the stunned silence in the cab. The driver slammed on the brakes. "Sir?" his aide asked, startled. Decker didn't answer. He was already out of the Humvee, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a thud. He strode toward the command building, his mind a maelstrom of shock and dawning fury. The impossible had happened, and in his experience, the impossible usually meant someone, somewhere, had lied. He stormed into the base's intelligence wing, bypassing 2 security checkpoints without breaking stride. His aide scrambled to keep up. "Get me archive access. Full retrieval on Operation Scimitar, Crimson 17 files." Al-Hudra, 2012, Decker barked at the sergeant manning the secure terminal. No redactions, no filters. Override code Decker, Alpha 7. The sergeant, a young man with wide, nervous eyes, hesitated. "Sir, those files are Tier 0 sealed. They require CENTCOM authorization." I was CENTCOM authorization when that file was sealed, Decker snapped, his voice like cracking ice. I am the chain of command. Open it. Now. The sergeant's fingers flew across the keyboard. The screen flickered, then filled with lines of blacked-out text, redacted reports, and grainy satellite images. Decker pushed the sergeant aside and took control of the terminal himself, scrolling through the personnel files. Cortez. Diaz, no relation. Ferris. Lynn. All marked Kia. Then he found it. A name near the bottom, almost an afterthought. Lieutenant Rowan M. Hale. Status MIA. Presumed Kia. Body unrecovered. Bring up her service file, Decker commanded, his voice barely a whisper. The system word. A loading icon spun for an agonizingly long moment, then a red box appeared on the screen, error 404. File not found. Record has been purged or relocated. Decker stared at the words. Purged. Not archived, not sealed. Purged. An act of digital annihilation. There was no log, no administrative trace. It was as if Lieutenant Hale had never existed. A cold dread settled in his stomach. This wasn't a cover-up. This was an erasure. Pull her current file, he ordered, his jaw clenched. Civilian contractor. Name is Rowan Hale. A new profile appeared instantly. A bland, sterile record. Technical certifications from obscure companies. A background check that was suspiciously, impossibly clean. And under military history, none. He stood there, staring at the two realities warring on the screens in front of him. The ghost of a decorated officer lost in the fires of Al-Hudra, and the sterile, fabricated identity of a civilian mechanic. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury Lieutenant Hale. But they had made one catastrophic mistake. They couldn't purge the ink from her skin. They couldn't erase the tattoo. Decker straightened up, a new, cold purpose solidifying in his eyes. The grief he had carried for 13 years was now reforged into a weapon. Find her, he said quietly to his shaken aide. Get me her location. No alerts, no sirens. I want to speak with this contractor myself. Immediately. Rowan found her sanctuary where the manicured gravel of the base met the untamed desert. It was a lonely stretch of perimeter fence behind the motor pool, a place no one had a reason to go. She sat on an overturned ammunition crate, watching the sun bleed across the horizon, bruising the sky in shades of violet and orange. The tank was running, its engine purring with a steady, powerful hum she had coaxed from it. Her job was done. The whispers had followed her as she left, no longer of mockery, but of awe and fear. It felt just as isolating. A shadow fell over her. She didn't look up, but she tensed. The sound of a footstep dragging slightly, accompanied by the soft tap of a cane, was achingly familiar. They always said that tattoo would get you in trouble, Lieutenant. The voice was rougher now, eroded by time and cheap whiskey, but it was a voice she had never expected to hear again. She slowly turned her head. Standing there was an old man in a worn-out maintenance supervisor's uniform. He was stooped, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, knowing, and full of a shared, silent pain. Sergeant Keller, Rowan breathed, the name feeling foreign on her tongue after so long. I thought you were dead. We were all dead, Keller said, letting out a wheezing groan as he lowered himself onto a crate beside her. That was the official story, wasn't it? Easier that way. He was Sergeant First Class Keller, her team's former demolitions expert. The report had listed him as killed by an IED during the initial ambush. For a long minute, they just sat in the fading light, two ghosts sharing a silence that was heavier than any words. Why, Rowan? Keller finally asked, his voice soft. 13 years. I heard whispers, sightings. A tech in Germany, a consultant in Diego Garcia. I was never sure. Why didn't you reach out? Because they told me not to, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was a tone she had perfected over the years. After the fire, after the smoke cleared, they pulled me out of the wreckage. Not for a medal. For a meeting. A man in a clean suit, in a tent that smelled of air conditioning. He told me the mission was a catastrophic failure based on bad intel. He said if a survivor surfaced, it would raise questions. Questions about who gave the order, about why our extraction was denied. Keller swore viciously under his breath. He said it was my duty, for the good of the country, for the memory of my team, to disappear. Rowan continued, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. They offered me a new identity. A clean slate. They didn't offer it. They gave it to me. They erased Rowan Hale, Lieutenant, Crimson, 17. And I let them. I was tired of fighting. Keller's shoulders slumped. They erased you to protect a general's career and cover up an intelligence leak. It was never about us. It was never about honor. He looked at her, his expression fierce. And you were the best of us, kid. You carried Cortez 300 meters under fire. You rewired the comms with nothing but a knife and some copper wire. You volunteered for every damn suicide run. They didn't just bury a soldier, they buried a hero. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Rowan's lips. I wasn't a hero. I was just the one who was too stubborn to die. There are others, Keller said gently. Hiding in plain sight, just like you. I found one running a climbing gear shop in Colorado. Another coaching high school football in Texas. We don't talk about it. We can't. But we know. We see the same ghosts in each other's eyes. Rowan's throat tightened. For 13 years, she had believed she was utterly, completely alone. The thing is, Rowan, Keller leaned forward, tapping his cane on the ground for emphasis. You can't hide who you are. It's in the way you walk, the way you work. It's in your damn spine. And now Decker's seen it. The whole base has seen it. He's tearing this place apart looking for your file right now. What am I supposed to do, Keller? She asked, the question a genuine plea. He looked her straight in the eye, his gaze unwavering. You survived for a reason. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. Maybe it's time to remind them what they buried. He stood up, his joints protesting. You weren't forgotten, Lieutenant. Just silenced. There's a world of difference. The next morning, the order came down, all motor pool personnel were to assemble in Hangar 4 for a technical debrief. The subject was the emergency repair of Havoc 1. It was a transparent pretext. This wasn't a debrief, it was a spectacle. Rowan stood beside the now pristine Abrams tank, a lone figure in the cavernous hangar. 50 soldiers and a handful of officers stood in a wide semicircle around her, their faces a mixture of curiosity, awe, and residual fear. In the back of the crowd, Diaz and Granger stood stiffly, their faces pale and drawn. The swagger was gone, replaced by a cold dread. Luke stood near them, looking utterly miserable. The captain who had given Rowan the order cleared his throat nervously. Ms. Hale will now, walk us through the diagnostic and repair sequence she employed. The air was thick with tension. Rowan picked up a torque wrench, her movements calm and deliberate. The primary failure wasn't the turbine controller, she began, her voice steady and clear, easily filling the cavernous space. It was a cascade failure originating in a secondary regulator. The standard diagnostic won't catch it because... She was interrupted by the sound of the heavy hangar doors rolling open. Major General Thomas Decker strode into the hangar, alone. He wore no hat, and his uniform jacket was unzipped. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, his eyes locked on Rowan. The entire assembly snapped to attention. A wave of rigid postures and sharp salutes rippled through the hangar. Decker ignored them all. He walked past the saluting officers, past the stunned soldiers, and stopped directly in front of the massive tank, his gaze never leaving Rowan. He looked from her face to the complex engine, then back again. "They say you performed a miracle, contractor," Decker said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "I just fixed a machine, General," Rowan replied, her voice even. Decker took another step closer. He turned his head slightly to address the silent, watching crowd. 13 years ago, in the Al-Hudra Valley, my vehicle was hit by an RPG. I was trapped inside the wreckage. It was burning. My leg was shattered. The order came down to abandon the vehicle, to fall back." He paused, letting the story sink in. He turned back to Rowan. But one soldier defied that order. A ghost. A silhouette in the smoke and flames. I couldn't see a face, couldn't see a rank. Just a figure crawling through the fire towards me. This soldier used a pair of steel wire cutters to sever a hydraulic line that had me pinned, dislocated my hip to pull me free, and dragged me to cover before the whole thing blew. His voice began to tremble with a memory relived. He looked around the hangar, at the sea of young, confused faces. Then his eyes, burning with an intensity that made everyone flinch, settled back on Rowan. "I never knew who it was. The report said everyone from that section was dead. But yesterday, I saw a tattoo. And today, I connected it to a purged file of a lieutenant whose last known action was rescuing an unnamed officer from a burning MRAP. He took one final step, standing just a foot away from her. The entire hangar held its breath. It was you, wasn't it?" Decker's voice was now raw, stripped of all rank and authority, filled only with a dawning, impossible realization. "You cut me out." Rowan met his gaze. Her mask of neutrality finally fell away, revealing the weary soldier beneath. "Your leg was pinned under the breech frame, sir," she said softly. "I just did what any soldier would." A collective gasp swept through the hangar. Diaz looked like he was going to be physically sick. Granger stared at the floor, his face the color of ash. General Decker's composure broke. His eyes welled up. He looked at the woman he had signed off on as dead, the ghost who had saved his life, the hero his own system had tried to erase. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand to his brow. He didn't just salute her. He held it, a long, rigid, and profoundly respectful tribute. It was the salute of a soldier to a better soldier, of a survivor to a savior. In that moment, all rank, all protocol, all the years of lies, evaporated in the face of a simple, undeniable truth. The salute in the hangar was a silent explosion, and its fallout permanently altered the landscape of FOB vigilance. The story spread faster than any official memo, carried on whispers of disbelief and newfound respect. Rowan Hale was no longer the strange civilian contractor, she was a living legend, the ghost of Crimson, 17. The change was most palpable in the ones who had been her loudest critics. Granger, the brutish enforcer, approached her workbench 2 days later. He didn't speak. He just placed a brand new, perfectly calibrated torque wrench on the table, a replacement for the one that had been lost, and walked away, his head bowed. Diaz caught her outside the mess hall. He stood in her path, blocking her way. For a moment, Rowan tensed, expecting another confrontation. Instead, he simply looked at her, his face a mess of shame and confusion, and rendered a clumsy, awkward salute before retreating. It was Luke, however, who made the most meaningful gesture. He found her by the perimeter fence, in her usual spot. He carried a tactical notebook and a pen. "Ma'am," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "That bypass you did on the comms rig, and the way you resequenced the turbine ignition, could you show me? The manual doesn't explain it like that." Rowan looked at the young soldier, at his genuine hunger to learn, to be better, and saw a flicker of the recruits she had once trained. She nodded. "Sit down, Private. Lesson 1, manuals tell you how a machine is supposed to work. I'll teach you all the ways it's designed to break. An official memo did arrive a week later. It was short and cryptic. Civilian contractor R. Hale is hereby appointed Senior Technical Advisor for all armored vehicle power systems. This appointment carries level 4 operational authority. Citation classified. General Decker had kept his word. He'd also begun a much larger, quieter war back at the Pentagon, using the full weight of his rank to unbury what had been hidden. Files were being reopened. Questions were being asked in hushed, angry tones in secure hearing rooms. The men who had erased Rowan Hale were beginning to feel the ground shift beneath their feet. But Rowan's victory wasn't in the memos or the backroom political battles. It was in the subtle, everyday shifts on the base. It was in the respectful nods that replaced the sneers. It was in the way mechanics now brought her their toughest problems, not as a last resort, but as a first opinion. It was in the nameplate someone had welded to her workbench, Hale. Crimson. Her most profound moment of change came not with a title, but with a choice. A new batch of recruits arrived, fresh-faced and full of unearned confidence. Rowan watched them struggle to secure the travel clamp on an Abrams cannon, a simple task they were turning into a dangerous comedy of errors. The old Rowan would have watched in silence and walked away. The new Rowan stepped forward. "You're fighting it," she said, her voice cutting through their frustrated shouts. They turned, startled. "You're using brute force. It's not about strength. It's about leverage. Watch." She placed her hands on the clamp, shifted her weight, and with a single, fluid motion, locked it into place. The recruits stared in stunned silence. That evening, as dusk settled over FOB vigilance, she sat on the crate behind the motor pool, a tin cup of coffee in her hands. She wasn't alone. Luke and 2 other young soldiers sat with her, their notebooks open, their faces illuminated by the glow of a single flashlight. She was teaching them about the ghost signals a failing engine sends, lessons learned in fire and loss. She had never wanted a medal or a parade. She had only ever wanted the space to do her duty. In the quiet hum of the desert night, surrounded by a new generation of soldiers, scarred, seen, and finally remembered, Rowan Hale had found it. She didn't come back for revenge or recognition. She came back to make sure no one else had to walk that path alone. Some heroes never get a statue, and their bravest moments are never recorded in history books. They live on in the quiet knowledge they pass down, in the lives they save, and in the standards they set. Rowan Hale's story is a testament to the silent professionals who carry the heaviest burdens long after the battle is over. What did her story make you think of? Have you ever known a quiet hero like Rowan, someone whose true strength was hidden in plain sight? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Please be sure to comment respectfully, as many here have their own experiences to share. Your voice helps us honor these legacies. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next tribute to the warriors who walk among us. And don't go just yet, there are more powerful stories waiting for you right here on the screen. Thank you for being part of this community.